People v. Casassa is a case that employs the extreme emotional disturbance doctrine because New York has adopted the Model Penal Code. That means that this case doesn't analyze any of the elements of heat of passion. It focuses exclusively on the elements required for extreme emotional disturbance. Was Casassa operating under an extreme mental or emotional disturbance for which there was a reasonable explanation or excuse? Casassa doesn't get EED because he doesn't fit the kind of person or emotion that warrants this kind of defense. We want to give extreme emotional disturbance defense to people whose disturbance fits our view of universal emotions that might make someone so disturbed. We don't have that here. In Casassa, we have an obsessive stalker. That's who we have. Each time I read this case, I have to tell you, I am so sad all over again for the victim. Her only mistake was she crossed paths with this guy who lived in her apartment building and that she casually dated for a short period of time. Once she stops seeing him, his obsession turns deadly. There's lots to unpack in this case regarding all the crimes he may have committed, but I want to move to his final encounter with her. He comes to the door of her apartment. He's holding flowers and wine and a knife, which he's concealed. When she rejects his gifts, he kills her. As we've done with other cases, when we see a purposeful killing, we're going to start at murder 2. Murder 2 is a homicide committed with malice. Here, the theory we're going to use for malice is the intent to kill. He stabbed her in the neck. That's certainly the use of the deadly weapon doctrine. And then he drowned her in a bathtub just to make sure she was dead. We can all see the intent to kill. At this point, you might be wondering why it was a murder 2 charge and not a murder 1 charge. After all, there's so much evidence of premeditation, you might be thinking. He comes to the apartment with the knife. He stabs her in the neck. He goes to drown her. He's got motive. The reason has to do with the setup of the criminal homicide codes in New York. That's where this case took place. At that time, the time of Casassa, murder 1 in New York was different than in most parts of the country. It wasn't based on how an actor killed. It wasn't based on premeditation. It was based on who was killed. It was never about the premeditation. It was reserved for killing certain people like police officers, correctional facility personnel. That's why he was charged with murder 2. If this killing took place in a different jurisdiction, I hope you can see that the prosecutor will want to argue murder 1 under the theory of premeditation. Casassa brings a knife to her apartment. Again, we see an interesting fact about bringing a weapon to the scene rather than it being a weapon of opportunity. But here, defendant is claiming he was entitled to the defense that he acted under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance. Taking the actor's situation and putting a reasonable person in that situation, would an ordinary citizen be moved to sympathy and understanding for why defendant was so disturbed? If you were Casassa's friend, would you get it? The trial court concluded the defendant's emotional reaction was peculiar to him, and the appellate court agreed. The court looked at the internal situation in which Casassa found himself and the external circumstances as he perceived them to be, and asked whether the emotional disturbance was reasonable. Here, it wasn't. Inside his head, he was horribly upset by her rejection. But the external circumstances were just that they were only casually dating for a few months. It wasn't a big deal. There wasn't a reasonable explanation for his disturbance. In fact, he looks a little crazy. If you were his friend and he came to you day after day telling you why he was so upset that he couldn't get her out of his mind, that he felt so rejected, you might listen once, you might even listen twice, but eventually you're going to say to him, okay, seriously, enough, move on. This opinion does a very good job of explaining some of the differences between the heat of passion doctrine and the extreme emotional disturbance doctrine. Heat of passion, the court says, focuses on provocation that caused a sudden response and could not have included any time to cool off. The Model Penal Code doesn't want to ask any of those questions. It has completely changed the narrative. It doesn't involve a specific kind of provocation, nor must the disturbance be spontaneously undertaken or even from that victim. The court also does an excellent job of breaking out EED into elements to make it more manageable to analyze. First element, was he in an extreme emotional disturbance? Check. Casassa was operating under an extreme disturbance. Second element, is there a reasonable explanation or excuse for that disturbance? No. No matter how relaxed this rule may seem, ultimately it's an objective test that has to be met, that normative standard. It's a little confusing here when I say it's a normative standard or an objective standard, because the court muddies the waters in its analysis. It makes it seem like a wholly subjective test when it says the following: the external circumstances as he perceives them to be, however inaccurate that perception might be. It makes it sound like it's only about defendant's perspective, but it's not. It's a little subjectified, but it's really an objective test. Casassa still loses. His disturbance was too peculiar. And there we go again. It's just like Guthrie's. We're not giving this defense to completely unrelatable disturbances. We would need to change the facts a lot to give Casassa a chance under extreme emotional disturbance. Maybe a marriage of 30 years. Casassa may have the defense. He's heartbroken, extremely disturbed. He's lost his family, he's lost his home. That disturbance may have a reasonable explanation or excuse. And remember, that's the question we ask. Was there a reasonable explanation or excuse for the disturbance? 30-year marriage, yes. Not a few months dating. Would Casassa have fared better under the heat of passion doctrine? I doubt it. The question might be different, but we get to the same place. You're casually dating this girl. Average people don't kill just because someone stops dating you.